Yeah. And many are drawing an analogy of the Cold War the United States had with the Soviet Union to describe the current situation between China and the United States. Do you think that China and the United States are already in the Cold War, or are they heading towards one?
I mean, I think before there was this controversy over the pandemic, over the virus, you could debate whether or not we were in a Cold War. I think at this point, it's quite clear we are in a Cold War.
A lot of people point out that even if China and the United States are engaged in the Cold War, it will be different from the previous one the United States had with Russia. What do you think are the primary differences and similarities of these two Cold War in terms of analogy?
And let me just point out what I think are the four principal differences. The first is that the US-Soviet competition began immediately after World War II. You had one of the bloodiest conflagrations in modern history, and the Soviet Union had suffered enormously. I think, therefore, both the United States and especially the Soviet Union were war-weary. They did not want to fight. Look at China and the United States today, and I think it's reflected in your comments. China feels like it's on the rise. China thinks that it deserves its place in the sun. China is not war-weary because it hasn't fought a war since 1979, and that was a minor war. Really, the last major war that the Chinese fought was against the United States in Korea. Yeah. So that's one very important difference. There's not a lot of war weariness here on the Chinese side like there was on the Soviet side. The second point is geography. The Soviet versus American competition was centered on Europe. It was centered on Germany. And it would have involved a land war between the two sides. So during the Cold War, we used to focus on the central front in Europe. And we used to look at the size of the armies, the size of the air forces, the thousands of nuclear weapons that both sides had. That's a very different situation than you have in Asia, where the principal theater of conflict is really the Western Pacific. It's the South China Sea, it's Taiwan, it's the East China Sea. We're not talking about a major land war on the Asian continent. I think this is important because it makes war more likely between the United States and China than between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War, because you're out in the water, you're not in the heart of Europe. Third point is, and this is the economic point, there is a tremendous amount of economic interdependence between the United States and China, and between China and countries like Japan and South Korea. A lot of economic interdependence. There was hardly any economic intercourse between the United States and the Soviet Union. We lived in two different worlds economically. So that's a matter of importance. The final point, and this is about ideology, and one could argue that China is not nearly as wedded to communism as the Soviet Union was. So this sort of communism versus liberal democracy or liberal capitalism is not going to be present. But the counter to that argument is nationalism. I think the nationalism in China is really remarkably high. This is not to say the Americans, with their sense of exceptionalism, aren't nationalistic. The Americans are nationalistic, the Japanese are nationalistic, so forth and so on. But the Chinese, in my opinion, are exceptionally nationalistic. They're exceptionally sensitive about slights. And I think when you take that nationalism, right, and you marry it to the realpolitik of this situation, the potential for trouble is really quite great. And it's not ultimately, therefore, that different than the US-Soviet competition, which evolved around the communism versus liberal democracy dimension.